Now, I covered this topic previously in another video, and of course, as time goes by, more and more people, of course, you're going to see as a result, and people always make some sort of excuse and they'll say, well, you know, it's not 100%, but then you've got Pfizer and Moderna saying it is 100% for young people under the age of like 50, but then we'll still see stuff like this where dozens test positive in Houston despite being vaccinated. The pharmacist feels it's more than 140 people in Houston have tested positive for COVID-19 despite being fully vaccinated. So that's according to the data. And of course, all these article links will be in the description. And again, like the flu vaccine, has a very low efficacy, and the flu vaccine has been around for quite some time. It has been thoroughly studied and tested. And even on the best year, you might get 50% efficacy. And that's across all age spectrums. In most geriatric patients, depending upon the year, it's usually between about 16 to maybe 25 or so percent in terms of its efficacy for like geriatric patients. Now, with that said, it's very out of the ordinary for a pharmaceutical company to come out and say that even for geriatric patients, that their vaccine has an efficacy of over 90%, even for geriatric patients, because for the most part, overwhelmingly, geriatric patients are more susceptible. And then, of course, again, with that said, I don't really care. I understand that people are still have the possibility of testing positive, just like you can get the flu shot and test positive for the flu. But it's really is the response of the government taking place, where they still tell individuals that you still have to wear a mask, you still have to social distance, you still shouldn't travel, you still shouldn't see your loved ones, you shouldn't hug your grandparents, etc. And it's this sort of information that is very detrimental to individuals from a mental health perspective. And that's really where the danger lies, is in the people's reaction to what these supposed scientists and medical experts are talking about. And it's not, this is by no means out of the ordinary. I did another video talking about it, and it's not just like in one particular area or in one particular age group, as there have been pockets all over the country. And it's the government's response that people should be worried about. Now, some individuals might think, well, there are going to be pockets and individuals. And then, of course, you come across a whole family, right? It says 3 New Jersey family members, like all 3 within the family, test positive despite taking the vaccine. It says and the father remains critically ill. So for those individuals who are like, well, you take it and it reduces your ability to be very, symptomatic. It diminishes the strength of the virus, and then this comes out as of the 13th, and this is 3 people within the same family. There's a video here, you can watch the video. And it says the whole family is questioning the efficacy of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine after 3 family members test positive for the virus after taking the shot in March. Now, some people might say, well, maybe they took it like a week later and they were positive beforehand, etc. And it goes on to say the father, Francisco Cosme, it says, remains critically ill at JFK University Medical Center in Edison. He received the vaccine on the 6th and started feeling sick on the 30th. Doctors aren't sure why. And so are the doctors just idiots? Do the doctors not know that it takes, X amount of time? No, these doctors understand how immunology works. They understand how quickly you should start to produce antibodies. And it goes on to say this is Johnson & Johnson efficacy was reported to be 72% in clinical trials, but it was better at keeping people who did get sick from being hospitalized. Not for this guy. And then they refer to these things as breakthrough infections. So a breakthrough infection or a vaccine failure is when a person contracts an infection despite being vaccinated. And this, of course, is according to Dr. Fauci. It says we see this with all vaccines in clinical trials, and in the real world, it says no vaccine is 100% efficacious or effective, which means that you will always see breakthrough infections regardless of the efficacy of the vaccine. And I do, and I agree that not all vaccines, and it's just very odd that all 3 individuals within the home do present with positive cases. With this man, of course, now when you look at the video, you'll see rather quickly that the family is obese, and of course, obesity impacts individuals' ability to kind of fend off this virus. But again, this isn't what individuals should be worried about. It's the response. It's the response, the government response. And again, this is by no means located with just in certain areas, as we see also in Chile. Right? And this is also, where's the date? This was not too long ago. Actually, when I pulled it up, it was 7 hours ago. So this is as of yesterday. It says Chile sees a surge despite vaccination success. Not all that successful if you're seeing a surge. It says Chile's health minister Enrique París has been striking a gloomy note at his daily COVID news conferences in recent days. This says the number of daily cases reached a new high on the 9th of April. It says going over 9,000 for the first time since the pandemic began. That's weird. How do you have a surge of new cases higher than before you started vaccinating? It's rather interesting, don't you think? It says their previous high was 7,000. They go in and vaccinate a huge majority of the population, and then now the cases spring. Really should make you think. Goes on to say it says it's worrying. This is worrying, he said last Friday. He says, we're going through a critical moment of the pandemic. I urge you to take care of yourselves and your loved ones and your family. Intensive care units are again overwhelmed. And again, intensive care, there's usually not a lot of beds in an ICU. You usually have limited, hospitals typically have a limited number of ICU beds. Usually it might be 10. You might see 12 ICU beds. I mean, you can create as many ICU beds as you want. You can throw in, a machine to create a negative pressure room. It doesn't mean you're going to have an ICU nurse. You can create ICU rooms to your heart's content. But what matters are the personnel, the ICU nurses that are able to manage these intubated patients who are on ventilation or on multiple drips, etc. And so typically most hospitals don't have large ICU capacities. And for the most part, these ICUs are typically more on the field side. I mean, most hospital units are. You can't run a hospital with empty beds, right? Because then how are you going to pay the bills, right? And so this narrative of, we're on the brink of being full. And it's like, but that's always been that way. Your goal is obviously to kind of fill the beds with patients so that you can earn revenue, because you got to pay the nurses, you got to pay the doctors, you got to pay the respiratory therapists, you got to pay the techs, the people who clean the rooms, right? So you typically have a full capacity or close to it. You usually leave like a crash bed, for example, on a step down, or you might have another bed in the ICU, and then you keep another bed in your step down so that just in case you do get admissions, because emergencies do happen, you then have overflow, right? And so that's nothing unusual. So when I read stuff like this, and ICU beds are almost full, and it's like, okay, what's new? There's nothing new there. You're not telling me anything that's new, but it does paint a picture. Now, of course, they're referring to cases, and I've done numerous videos talking about cases, but I prefer hospitalizations. For me as a nurse, I prefer to know what the hospitalization rates are. Are they above capacity? How much above capacity are they, especially for the time of the year? It says it feels like we're going backward. It says we need to download special permits online to be allowed out just twice a week for essential things like food shopping or doctor's visits. And again, now this is what they're saying according to a resident, Sophia Pinto. It says we need to download special permits. Now again, if you're having a respiratory illnesses thrive indoors because of the lack of circulation. And so you have family members. So instead of getting fresh air, right? And so instead of getting fresh air into your domicile wherever you're living, keep the windows open so that the air is just flowing instead of the air just circulating. That's why the statistics show that there were more sicknesses related to people who stayed indoors than to people who remained outdoors. And that's just logic, right? That should have been known by most individuals. Most people should have been able to figure that out on their own. You don't need a PhD or a doctor a doctor's license to understand that. So it doesn't surprise me that if they're forcing individuals to stay indoors, that they're having a prevalence of the virus because it's a respiratory illness. Says the frustration and confusion many Chileans are feeling over the renewed lockdowns is due partly to the fact that just 2 months ago, the president said they were boasting about Chile having one of the fastest vaccination rollouts in the world. They're like, they're applauding each other, politicians patting themselves on the back, and they're like, oh shit, what's going on here? They can't understand it. But it should cause individuals to think that if people are getting vaccinated and then are testing positive after the fact, and you're seeing an increase in hospitalizations, I don't know. Well, you gotta be careful what you say on YouTube. It says what went wrong. It says critics have accused the Pinera government of getting caught up in what is this? Triumphant. Oh, can't even say the word. This is over the vaccine rollout and having loosened restrictions. That's what they're blaming it on. They're saying you were too confident. You let us out. You gave us back our freedom too early. It's your fault. It goes on to say, it says, like governments across the world, ministers have faced difficult choices. It says Chile's borders have been closed. It says bar for a few week exceptions. It says from March to November back in 2020. But after a strict lockdown had driven the rolling 70 average down to 1,300 cases in November, it says the decision was taken to reopen, including the international tourists. It says Chileans were also given special holiday permits to travel more freely around the country during the Southern Hemisphere summer holiday. It says after some experts argued that it was important for people's mental health. And that's true. You can't keep people locked up. Humans by nature require interaction with other individuals. And of course, you'll just end up with a mental health crisis. As restaurants, shops, and holidays, resorts were opened up to kickstart the faltering economy. And for countries that can't afford to shut down because they can't print money like they can in here, what happens is those countries then go into debt to the central banks, and they beg them to to give us some money so that they can create stimulus, give out stimulus checks to the people so that the people don't starve. But all this does is actually prolonged them being impoverished, right? You don't beg for a loan. You tell them, I need to go back to work. And the reality is that people need to go back to work regardless of the outcome, because the only thing that will happen is it will increase the debt of the country. And when the country can't pay that back, the country defaults, and then people just come in and say, well, what do you have that I can take that is of value? And then they take the land, or they take over businesses, or in essence, you have what's called indentured servitude to the central banks. Now, this isn't the only thing that I did want to touch on. What could be, again, what matters to me is not cases. As you can see, rapid tests in New England may be scaled back over false positives. Shocker. It says leaked emails. It says seen by the Guardian show the urgent need for decisions on the so-called asymptomatic testing. So I talked about this before, and I showed a video where Dr. Fauci himself stated, and I'll play it now.
To just add one thing that seems to get lost in that question is that, as Bob said, and I agree, we would really like to see the data, because if there is asymptomatic transmission, it impacts certain policies that you do regarding screening, et cetera. But the one thing historically people need to realize, that even if there is some asymptomatic transmission, in all the history of respiratory-borne viruses of any type, asymptomatic transmission has never been the driver of outbreaks. The driver of outbreaks is always a symptomatic person. Even if there's a rare asymptomatic person that might transmit, an epidemic is not driven by asymptomatic carriers.
And so he goes on to say that literally in the entirety of all respiratory diseases, not just during his career, but like when they look back, as far back as they can tell in the entire history of all respiratory diseases, that there is no such thing as asymptomatic spread and the ability to transmit a pandemic from person to person to person. As he stated in the video, that overwhelmingly, according to history and according to his findings, that there is no such thing as asymptomatic spread, because the type of people that will spread a disease are people with symptoms. And so now we're seeing the results. And there was numerous articles talking about this, and I talked about this, and I think in a video or two ago, where there was, of course, a lot of false positives. And so now they're stating, now, of course, this information is coming back and it's saying the senior government officials, and this is according to the Guardian News, has raised urgent concerns about the mass expansion of rapid coronavirus testing. This estimates that as few as 2 to 10% of positive results may be accurate with low COVID rates, such as London. And it's like you play that bum, 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 bum. And I talked about this extensively in many videos, that the rapid tests were faulty, and that's where they got the concept of asymptomatic spread, because there's no such thing as asymptomatic spread. Any healthcare practitioner who is worth his salt would be able to tell you that there's no such thing as asymptomatic spread. And so this was actually what was utilized to fearmonger to, the regular normies, that if you don't wear a mask, you're spreading it to people. You're walking about in your daily life, and just walking about, you could spread COVID. Now, just the other day, I was out and I went to get a sandwich. I went to go get a gyro, and I was talking to the guy, and I see this couple walking by me, and I see them both of them. Maybe it was like a husband and wife with an N95 mask, and then another surgical mask over that, with a face shield over their face, out in public. And this is the stuff that I have extra of these because the hospital gave them to us when there was a shortage, and I basically held on to one of these things for months because we didn't have them. We didn't have them for so long because of the supply chain disruptions. So they were telling us, hold on to your mask because we might not have another one to give you because we don't have any. That was what they were telling us. And I see people out in the street wearing these exact same sort of masks that we as healthcare practitioners use when we're actually coming in contact with symptomatic patients, not just susceptible individuals, but individuals who are showing symptoms. This is the sort of stuff that we wear like around flu patients or around individuals who actually are symptomatic for C19, for COVID. And so it just goes to show you how much propaganda and how much fear mongering has been placed into the people, that they become so afraid that you even see people walking around like they're living in Chernobyl, or they're like, I feel like when I go outside and I see some of these people, like I'm living in a modern day, like I'm living in a modern day Fallout, and people are walking around, with they had gloves on. They had gloves, an N95, a surgical mask with a visor over their face just to go to the bank. And I'm just like, bruh, like, that's the sort of thing that I was talking about, the mental health implications for some of these individuals, especially for people who already have mental health issues. Like, for example, maybe they were like hypochondriacs, the people who always think that they have some sort of disease, or like the people who are like constantly washing their hands, right? Those type of people, or those people who are always cleaning stuff, right? Those are the people who are going to be primarily impacted. Their lives will be impacted probably for the rest of their life, because of what's going on. The whole, I was right. The people who are like, very, anti-germ, etc. Like, what's that guy, the bald guy, that has that game show? I forget his name, but he's like very much, like he touches someone's hand and he's like immediately using hand sanitizer. I forgot that dude's name, but he's like kind of famous. But this just goes to show you that as a lot of this information starts to come out, that individuals realize maybe they were duped. And the real question is why. Some people might say it's for control, and I thought that too for quite some time. I was like, oh, it's just about control. But it's much deeper than that, because these individuals who are in positions of authority already have control. They already have a control of the currency. They already have control of the indices, right? Most of these individuals, they have control of the banks. So it can't just be about control because they already have it. It has to be something deeper, something I fear is much more sinister. And the reality is that only time will tell. Only time will tell. But people should be on the watch. They should have been on the watch when the government was stating that they were going to shut everything down for 2 weeks and that your business and your job and your life wasn't essential. And people decided to give up their freedoms. And now all of this information is coming out, but people have already been propagandized, and it's very difficult if you don't have a strong will, it's very difficult to get over the propaganda, especially for individuals who've been severely impacted by this. And it's these individuals, along with the police, which are the ones that you should be fearful of moving forward, as I've shown in my last video, where you even had, what was it, in St. Vincent, where they had the volcano. And then Royal Caribbean said, well, you can't board the ship if you're not vaccinated. It will only get worse moving forward. And if more people don't wake up, more atrocities will be committed. That's just a reality. Because this is where we're at. We're at the stage, we're at a huge turning point in humanity. And if individuals don't take a stand, and the reality is that there may be a need for a measure of force to push back against entities and against some of these individuals, even as high as, it's the police and the military that are going to be the ones that you really should worry about, because those are the ones who are going to be willing to commit atrocities for the elites. That's just a reality. The more that you back the blue, the more that you choose to back, your local military, those are the people that are going to be the ones that are going to enslave you. Those are the people that are going to be the ones who are going to enforce, all of these restrictions upon your life. You got to wake up. You got to wake up sooner than later, because it's not going to get better.